Hello and welcome back to the Patient First podcast. I'm so excited that you're here. Today, we're going to have a broad conversation based on another conversation that I had with a fantastic dentist who said, Bryan, I'm in your VIP membership. I'm watching the courses and there's all of this fantastic information. However, how do I actually implement this stuff when I'm already busy? Sound familiar? I've heard this a lot from people. And frankly, I've experienced it myself because there's always going to be a fire of the day to put out, right? You might have a team member who just left your practice, that team member that you thought was the glue that held everybody together. Or maybe you had a patient complain, a patient that you really like complain, or you had a patient come in that you don't like seeing and you know they're going to complain, right? Those distract us from where we want to be, the success that we want to have in our practice and our lives. If you get a bad review, man, that can really throw you for a loop for a week. Tax payments you might not be expecting, or you go to do a composite and there's no adhesive, right? Your assistant or whoever does your ordering forgot to order it, and there's no adhesive when you need it. Those things happen all day, every day, all day long. And so, how do we actually reach our goals? Well, today I'm going to talk about the answer to that. The answer is broadly, and I'll break it down in a bit, but think long term, act short term. So we have to think long term, but act short term. Here's what I mean. Think of your long term goal of being like a compass, the direction that you're headed. For your practice, that might be if you're a single dentist practice with 2 chairs or 4 chairs, maybe you want to grow to be 8 chairs. Maybe you want to start doing implants, or maybe you want to grow to a multi-dentist practice or even a DSO. We'll talk a little bit more about thinking long-term in a bit, but I want to move on to how acting in the short term, because we just can't think up some big dream and then have our dreams come true, right? We have to actually think of our dream, but then take the small actions on a day-to-day consistent basis to reach our long-term goals. And I think that's where a lot of people fail. They think of this big vision that's so big that they don't know the first step to take, but that's really the key, is just taking that next step each time. So acting short term really means breaking down your goal into chunks and then starting with the first step. So as an example, if you had a goal that you wanted to read 20 books a year, and I think a lot of people do have a goal, they want to read books. So I'll break that one down. So if you wanted to read 20 books in a year and you sit down and you think, today I'm going to start off with the best-selling book, The Patient First Manifesto, and I'm going to read this as the first book of 20 in a year, right? It's going to seem daunting because you're like, oh my gosh, once I get done with this, there's got 19 more to go. But what if you said next month? So in the next month, I'm going to take 4 weeks and read 2 chapters every week, right? That seems more digestible because I've got 7 days to read 2 chapters. But, and here's where a lot of people are going to fail, is they don't really know when does that going to happen. So what's the best goal? In my opinion, the best goal is to say, tonight, I am going to read 1 word, just 1 word, right? Because that word will likely become a chapter, probably 2. If you're reading the Patient First Manifesto, you'll probably read the whole thing, right? Because you just keep it going. You read a word. I mean, I like to speed read, so I can't even read just 1 word. But if you set that as a goal, you're going to be doing the action that gets you along the path of your goal. How far down you go, it gets to be too big. So break it down into a chunk. And eventually, if you sit down and you say 5 times a week, I'm going to read at least 1 word in a book. Chances are, if you did that as your goal, I think you'd look up and you'd outpace your goal. So step number 1, which I'm going to emphasize strongly here, is the hardest part. I have struggled with this because I've reached my goals lots of times and realized it was the wrong goal. This, my friends, is be careful what you wish for. So this is very, very, very important. It sounds like it's easy setting the goal. Like if you want reading 20 books in a year, maybe that's your goal. But if your goal was to do something completely different than reading a book, like maybe you wanted to actually learn to speak German, and you thought that reading German books would get you there, and there'd be a better way to do it. kind of a bad example, but setting the goal is incredibly important, right? You need to have a vision to make it a reality. And once you have that vision, if you make it a reality, you want to make sure that that's the reality that you want. It's so much harder to set goals than people admit. I've talked about it before on this podcast. Every year I go snowboarding by myself for 3 days just to come up with my goals for the year. It's that important to me. Coming up with the right goals is critically important in my life, in my world. For me, this is about 85% of the work, just setting the right long-term goals. Incredibly powerful, but way underestimated. How to set goals is a whole art in and of itself, but setting the right goal is important. So don't just gloss over this, thinking you know what it is. Put some thought into it. If we're talking about your practice, the difference between wanting to own 50 practices and just be managing that growth versus, being really good at doing uh, endodontics or implants. Those are two very different visions, and they're both goals that you could set as long-term goals. And once you hit them, you're either going to be happy or dissatisfied with the goals that you hit. So don't don't overlook the value in setting the right goal. After you have done that, though, I'm going to assume that you've figured out what your goals are and you've set the right ones. Then plan it out. The next 90 days. Now, there's a lot of research around 90 being the right short-term goal. So think about 90 days or less, right? If you have fires to put out then, and we all do, put out those fires, extinguish them that are that are that are in line with your overall goals. That might seem harder than it actually is, but I don't know your situation. What that means is, let's say your long-term goal was to own 50 practices, and right now you have one. If you had that one person that was so key to you leave, look, you could put in an ad and look for the right person, or you could look to buy the practice that has the right person in it. That is two completely different strategies. But if your goal is to own a DSO, maybe it's time to use that issue, that fire, as the spark for you to get the next practice. Acquire a practice with a great team. And maybe you don't just get one great person, maybe you get 5 great people. I've done this when I was looking to get a larger space for my practice. Multiple times, actually. We were bursting at the seams. The first 2 physical spaces I had, I looked at the space and I said, well, we need to get a larger space. But I didn't just get a larger space. The second practice I bought, I actually had a bigger space than they needed. So I bought that practice and moved my practice into it because I knew I wanted to have a multi-dentist location. So rather than just finding a space and renting, I found another practice to merge with my own. And then I knew I wanted to buy the space, the practice the physical location that my practice was in. So I found a building that was 8,000 square feet, much larger than I needed. So I actually rented out 2 floors and acquired another practice to join with mine. So because I knew I had a long-term vision of where I wanted to go. That's my situation, whatever situation it is for you. If you have that long-term vision, when you have a fire that presents itself, you can marry that with your vision. And it's surprising how often those two actually, you look back and you go, that fire that I had was just the initial spark that got me to do what I needed to do to fulfill my goals. So then step number 3 is make sure that you track it. Track it with somebody else that you're accountable to. That way, if you fall off track, if you stray off a little bit, you think, boy, I want to really start doing implants. And then you sign up for the course, but something happens in your family and you can't go to the course on doing implants. Well, if you're tracking it, you'll see that you may have missed it out on this quarter, but you'll replan and get right back on track. Things will throw you off track. But if you have that North Star, if you know the vision of where you want to go and you've thought about it long and hard, and you know that is where you want to go, you'll be pulled back towards it when you get hit off track. So that's the 3 steps that I would recommend you do to think long-term, act short-term. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, comments, let me know. Always up for comments, and subscribe. And if you want to find out more, go to upgradedental.com. Thank you very much, and talk to you next